What we want from our cameras and autofocus systems is simple. Log on, track the subject, and nail the shot. Canon, Sony, Nikon, they all claim to do it best, but in this video we find out who actually does. I'm Wegener and I've been a bird photographer for over 20 years, creating unique photos and videos of the world's most stunning birds and teaching you to create your own masterpieces, dial in the right settings, and find the right gear. Over the years, I've extensively used every single camera from all the major brands, giving me clear insights on how they perform, when they will shine, and when they are most likely to let you down. There will be times when all autofocusing systems struggle equally bad, for instance a bird hidden amongst the grasses, but there are also times when one system clearly outperforms the others. And for us as photographers, it's very important to be aware of the limitations of our autofocusing system. So whenever we encounter a situation in the field where we think our camera may struggle, we can intervene and help the autofocusing system and the camera along, still allowing us to capturing great photos. These days we get pretty amazing eye-tracking autofocus in almost all mirrorless cameras, but generally speaking, the higher you go up in the lineup and the more expensive the camera gets, the better autofocus we can expect. For Canon, I would say we get very high-end autofocus from the R6 series and upwards. For Nikon, we get that in the Z8 and the Z9, and for Sony, we get that in the A9 and the A1 series. The other cameras in the lineup will still perform very well, but the top-level cameras will give us an edge, especially when the going gets tough. We also have to be aware that these days autofocusing systems basically consists of two parts. The AI subject detection that identifies and finds our subject for us, and then the actual autofocusing system that follows the lead of the subject detection and tries to track the subject for us. But that also means that just because the overlay of the subject detection is on your subject doesn't necessarily guarantee you that the actual autofocus will also find the subject and that all your images will be in focus. What truly matters and will give us the best performance in the field is great subject detection that combines with great autofocusing capabilities. So we instantly find our subject, log onto it, and then can track it for as long as we want without the autofocus jumping off. If you want to learn more about the best settings for Canon, Nikon, and Sony, check out my settings videos I've posted on this channel and also my setup guides on my website that I've linked below. My settings will turn your camera into a real powerhouse, giving you the best performance in the field and get you on your way to only capturing razor-sharp photos. And the best part is, alongside my PDF setup guides, I'm also providing you with my camera setup file so you can install all my settings onto your own camera with just one click. So with the best camera settings dialed in, let's see how they actually perform. In this video, I want to highlight the situations where each autofocusing system shines and when it is at its worst. So if you're looking for a new camera or maybe think about switching brands, you will notice that depending on the subject that you want to photograph, the different brands can give you quite different autofocusing performance. Overall, all three of them perform pretty well, but there's also certain shooting situations where one clearly outperforms the others. What I've found over the years is that most autofocusing systems do a great job tracking easy to identify subjects like people or cars, for instance. But where the real differences come out is if we try to photograph smaller subjects like birds, for instance, that can also look vastly different to the subject detection. Let's start with a simple autofocusing task that I would expect basically every camera to nail. A bird that is a decent size in your frame on a nice open perch with a nice autofocus background. I've taken tens of thousands of images like this with a multitude of cameras, and if your camera can't lock onto target like this, something is seriously wrong, either with your settings, your technique, or with your camera. So from all big brands, I would definitely expect basically flawless performance here. You may have the rare occasion that the camera jumps slightly on and off, but from all major brands and their top tier cameras at least, I would expect almost 100% keeper rate in a scenario like this. However, if we increase the level of difficulty and now shoot a smaller subject that's surrounded by distractions, things start to look very differently quite quickly. There are certain situations where all camera systems struggle and drive us mad, but generally speaking, I would say that the Canon subject detection is the best. It can find quite small birds reliably in the grass or amongst bushes with other obstacles around, and it also manages to not only find them but log onto them and stay logged onto them pretty well. And it can also do that with the whole area autofocus tracking, which makes it super easy to use. Of all the cameras I've used, my R5 II and R1 are probably the best at identifying and tracking very small subjects in my frame. In this area, it's noticeably faster and more decisive than what the competition has to offer. Nikon also does a very good job in tracking smaller subjects amongst distractions, but you will notice that the autofocus sometimes feels a little bit more undecisive and unsure as to what the target is that you want to track. For instance, there can be situations where the subject detection overlay is on your subject, but the autofocus is actually somewhere else, maybe stuck on a little leaf right next to your bird, or you find situations where in a burst of images, the autofocus has a slight tendency to jump on and off the target. Shooting smaller, rather stationary subjects amongst branches or rocks or smaller subjects in general surprisingly seems to be the biggest challenge for Sony's subject detection and autofocusing system. I've encountered a fair few situations where Sony's wide area autofocus subject detection simply was not able to identify my relatively small subject in the frame initially, and I had to use a smaller zone or the spot autofocus to lock it onto my target. Interestingly, once I use the spot autofocus or the small zone, the wide area autofocus can then also afterwards identify my target, but the initial subject detection is where it's lacking a little bit. The autofocus still performs at a very high level, but it's more indecisive when it's focusing on smaller subjects than Canon, for instance. Another area where the Sony subject detection seems to struggle a little bit is birds swimming on water or sitting on the ground. In particular, if the bird is relatively small in your frame, slow moving, and you're also relatively close to the ground with your camera. In those situations, it seems like the subject detection and autofocus get distracted by the waves or the ground quite easily and then tend to drift away from your subject towards the photographer. In these situations, Canon and Nikon often give us a more reliable performance. Now, a big duck swimming on a lake is not a challenge for any of these cameras, but the smaller the subject gets, the bigger Canon's advantage will get. In these shooting situations, Sony's autofocusing systems will perform much better if you're using like spot autofocus or small zone and keep that on your target. However, that comes with its own set of challenges because if your subject suddenly takes off, you're a lot more likely to lose that action moment if you're shooting with a small zone compared to like a wide area autofocus. Taking great raw files in the field is step one, but step two that's equally important is to learn a good editing workflow that allows you to edit all those raw images and make them shine. And this is why I developed my Lightroom and next generation Photoshop masterclasses. In my classes, I teach you step by step and in easy to follow chapters all the important tools and techniques you need to know to be able to get great results from even your most difficult to edit raw files. But of course, you won't just be watching because I'm also providing you with my own raw files so you can edit right alongside me. And if you're not sure if my classes are worth it or the right fit for you, check out some of the amazing reviews that I receive on a daily basis from many happy students who I've helped to transform their editing lives, who now get great results with ease and actually enjoy editing their photos. So if you want to learn an easy to follow workflow that you can apply to all your raw files and get great results every single time, make sure to check out my masterclasses down there in the description. I know that will help you a lot. But let's move away from slow moving and perch subjects and look at fast action and birds in flight. And here the results will look very differently. When it comes to photographing decent sized birds in your frame of not too fast moving birds, all three systems give you fantastic autofocusing performance, and I would expect amazing results from almost all cameras. Yet I would already give a slight edge to Sony because it seems to be the one autofocusing system that has the tendency to be the most locked on when it comes to action photography. While for some reason Sony's subject detection sometimes struggles to pick up a perch bird, it's extremely fast and accurate when it comes to picking up moving subjects even when they are small in our frames. I have no explanation for this other than maybe me moving the same pace as the subject gives the autofocus an indication what the subject is and what I want to track. Canon's newer cameras like an R5 II or an R1 are also very good in tracking action, but they lag slightly behind the autofocusing systems that we can find in the A9 III and the A1 II, for instance. And generally speaking, I would expect a larger amount of keepers when I'm using Sony compared to Canon or Nikon. In the past, fast-moving subjects have been a big challenge for Nikon, but their autofocusing system definitely has come a long way, and now you can also track even relatively small subjects against varying backgrounds with ease. And this is one area that I'm very happy to see improve with all camera manufacturers. In the past, tracking subject against varying backgrounds was always a big challenge, but now all three systems, and in particular Canon and Sony, do a fantastic job in tracking any kind of target against basically any sort of background, even when it's quite busy. The difference in performance gets even more amplified when we're shooting very fast action. Here it seems like the faster the action, the better the Sony autofocusing gets and the further it pulls away from the competition. I've even been able to track tiny azure kingfishers in flight with Sony's 2.8 300mm lens, a 2x extender, and the A9 III in low light conditions at very high ISOs and got some very nice result. This is one area that I found super impressive and something that I probably wouldn't even attempt with a Canon and Nikon camera. In fairness though, I have to say that obviously the 120 frames per second here of the A9 III also helped me a lot in capturing a lot more photos of the few short seconds the bird was actually in my viewfinder. Nikon also does a good job for birds in flight and action photography, but it has a distinct disadvantage of not having RAW pre-capture and only shoots at 20 frames per second in RAW. Now that's still plenty, but compared to the faster cameras and having pre-capture, there are certain situations where you miss certain moments or may just miss the best pose. In the end, all of these cameras do a fantastic job in tracking fast action, but if I had to pick a camera to nail a certain action moment, I would have a hard time going past an A9 III. One area where Canon autofocus seems to struggle a bit more than the competition is subjects coming directly at you. Cameras like an R5 II or R1 have gotten better at this, but there's still room for improvement, and Nikon and Sony here have an easier time tracking one of those subjects. The next category is one that Nikon actually can't really compete in because we don't have RAW pre-capture available on their bodies. Lately I've been taking a lot of photos in my backyard of birds taking off, giving me stunning mid-air poses. And here I've been using the Sony A9 III, pre-capture and the 120 frames per second. And the idea is that I pre-focus on the bird that's sitting on the perch, activate pre-capture, and when it takes off, the camera takes some images for me and I track the bird through my viewfinder and end up with a fantastic pose. And this actually works really well. In theory, this should work very well with Canon bodies as well because we also have pre-capture and fast frame rates available, but the implementation of the pre-capture and the autofocus tracking doesn't work as well as Sony's. And the big issue here is that Canon's pre-capture and autofocusing has the tendency to stick to the perch rather than the subject when the subject is taking off, even if you have been focusing on your subject. It seems like the Canon's pre-focusing and autofocus implementation gets used to the static scene and then thinks that the static scene is what you want to focus on rather than the bird that is taking off. And the only workaround I've found for this is to basically not focus too long when it comes to Canon cameras and pre-focusing. So with Sony, I can just half press the shutter button and just wait for 30 seconds before refocusing, and the bird will still be tracked when it's taking off. But with Canon, it's much better to just focus for like 3 to 5 seconds, let go, and then focus again, let go, and then focus again. In those situations, it seems like the camera doesn't get as attached to your perch and you have a bigger chance of actually focusing on the bird taking off. But compared to Sony, the rate of keepers with pre-capture and the bird taking off is definitely a lot lower on the Canon bodies, but hopefully this is something that can be tweaked in the future. You can of course also capture birds taking off or great mid-air action with slower frames per second or no pre-capture, but Sony overall has a substantial edge here with the best pre-capture implementation, the best tracking autofocus, and the highest frames per second available. Ultimately, Canon's, Nikon's and Sony's autofocusing systems perform very well and we never had better autofocus available to us, so we should actually consider ourselves very lucky. But at the same time, I found it very interesting to see the differences in the field and that depending on your shooting scenario and subject, the performance of the different autofocusing systems can vary quite a bit. For me, the best all-rounder overall is Canon. It gives us solid performance across the board. It's exceptional for small subjects in your frame and subjects sort of surrounded by distraction, and it works well for action. And on top of that, it's also probably the easiest to set up and use. Nikon for me has very solid, no-frills autofocus that gives us good results most of the time. What makes them the most enticing is not necessarily the autofocus, but the amazing set of lenses they have on offer. They're typically not too expensive, relatively lightweight, and perform very well with their cameras. And on top of that, we also get fantastic video tracking autofocus that I would put slightly ahead of Canon and Sony. Sony's autofocusing system is the winner when it comes to action photography. While it seems to struggle with subjects smaller in your frame and subject detection from time to time for more static subjects, it makes up for it when it comes to action photography. Here the subject detection and autofocus work very well, lock onto your target with ease and give you a high rate of keepers. This is also aided by the best pre-capture implementation on the market. Overall, you'd be hard pressed to find a better keeper rate for fast moving action than using an A9 III or an A1 II. To sum it up, if I want to shoot a small, rare bird somewhere out in the field, I would gravitate towards an R5 Mark II because I have high megapixels and great subject detection and tracking. If I wanted to shoot in a tough low light situation, I would probably grab an R1 because of the great image quality and the great autofocusing. And if I wanted to shoot fast moving action and needed a high frame rate, I would undoubtedly go for an A9 III. Besides that, if I wanted to get great action focus, high megapixels and a good overall around camera, I would go for an A1 II. And lastly, if I wanted to get very good autofocusing performance with amazing lenses, I would grab a Nikon. What would it be for you? And what is your current camera system of choice? Are you happy with the autofocusing performance? Have you had similar experiences to me in the field? Let me know down there in the comments. Also give me a thumbs up for the video. Check out my setup guides, channel membership and masterclasses. And of course, hit that subscribe button so we can grow our community. And I'll see you in another video very soon. Bye.